The American Wife by Frank O'Connor. Elsie Collery, who was on a visit to her cousins in Cork, was a mystery even to them. Her father, Jack Collery's brother, had emigrated when he was a kid and done well for himself. He had made his money in the liquor business and left it to go into wholesale produce when Elsie was growing up because he didn't think it was the right background for a girl. He had given her the best of educations, and all he had got out of it was to have Elsie telling him that Irish men were more manly, and that even Irish Americans let their wives boss them too much. What she meant was that he let her mother boss him, and she had learned from other Irish people that this was not the custom at home. Maybe Mike Collery, like a lot of other Americans, did give the impression of yielding too much to his wife, but that was because she thought she knew more about things than he did, and he was too soft-hearted to disillusion her. No doubt the Americans, experienced in nostalgia, took Elsie's glorification of Irishmen good-humouredly, but it did not go down too well in Cork, where the men stood in perpetual contemplation of the dangers of marriage, like cranes standing on one leg at the edge of the windy water. She stood out at the Collery's quiet little parties with her high waist and wide skirts, taking the men out to sit on the stairs while she argued with them about religion and politics. Women having occasion to go upstairs thought this very forward, but some of the men found it a pleasant relief. Besides, like all Americans, she was probably a millionaire, and the most unworldly of men can get a kick out of flirting with a real millionaire. The man she finally fell in love with did not sit on the stairs with her at all, though, like her, he was interested in religion and politics. This was a chap called Tom Barry. Tom was 35, tall and thin and good-looking, and he lived with his mother and two good-looking sisters in a tiny house near the barrack, and he couldn't even go for a walk in the evening without the three of them lining up in the hallway to present him with his hat, his gloves and his clean handkerchief. He had a small job in the courthouse and was not without ambition. He had engaged in several small business enterprises with his friend Jerry Coakley, but all they had ever got out of these was some good stories. Jerry was 40 and he had an old mother who insisted on putting his socks on for him. Elsie's cousins warned her against setting her cap at Tom, but this only seemed to make her worse. "I guess I'll have to seduce him," she replied airily, and her cousins, who had never known a well-bred Catholic girl to talk like that, were shocked. She shocked them even more before she was done. She called at his house when she knew he wasn't there and deluded his innocent mother and sisters into believing that she didn't have designs on him. She badgered Tom to death at the office, gave him presents and even hired a car to take him for drives. They weren't the only ones who were shocked. Tom was shocked himself when she asked him point blank how much he earned. However, he put that down to unworldliness and told her. "But that's not even a street cleaner's wages at home," she said indignantly. "I'm sure, Elsie," he said sadly. "But then, of course, money isn't everything." "No, and Ireland isn't everything," she replied. It was peculiar, but from their first evening together she had never ceased talking about America to him, the summer heat and the crickets chattering and the leaves alive with fireflies. During her discussions on the stairs, she had apparently discovered a great many things wrong with Ireland, and Tom, with a sort of mournful pleasure, kept adding to them. "Oh, I know," he said regretfully. "Then if you know, why don't you do something about it?" "Ah, well, I suppose it's habit, Elsie," he said, as though he weren't quite sure. "I suppose I'm too old to learn new tricks." But Elsie doubted if it was really habit, and it perplexed her that a man so clever and conscientious could at the same time be so lacking in initiative. She explained it finally to herself in terms of an attachment to his mother that was neither natural nor healthy. Elsie was a girl who loved explanations. On their third outing she had proposed to him, and he was so astonished that he burst out laughing, and continued to laugh whenever he thought of it again. Elsie herself couldn't see anything to laugh at in it. Having been proposed to by men who were younger and better looking and better off than he was, she felt that she had been conferring an honour on him. But he was a curious man, for when she repeated the proposal, he said with a cold fury that hurt her, "Sometimes I wish you'd think before you talk, Elsie. You know what I earn, and you know it isn't enough to keep a family on. Besides, in case you haven't noticed it, I have a mother and 2 sisters to support." "You could earn enough to support them in America," she protested. "And I told you already that I had no intention of going to America." "I have some money of my own," she said. "It's not much, but it would mean I'd be no burden to you." "Listen, Elsie," he said, "a man who can't support a wife and children has no business marrying at all. I have no business marrying anyway. I'm not a very cheerful man, and I have a rotten temper." Elsie went home in tears and told her astonished uncle that all Irish men were pansies, and as he had no notion what pansies were, he shook his head and admitted that it was a terrible country. Then she wrote to Tom and told him that what he needed was not a wife, but a psychiatrist. The writing of this gave her great satisfaction, but next morning she realised that her mother would only say that she had been silly. Her mother believed that men needed careful handling. The day after, she waited for Tom outside the courthouse, and when he came out, she summoned him with 2 angry blasts on the horn. A rainy sunset was flooding the western road with yellow light that made her look old and grim. "Well," she said bitterly, "I'd hoped I'd never see your miserable face again." But that extraordinary man only smiled gently and rested his elbows on the window of the car. "I'm delighted you came," he said. "I was all last night trying to write to you, but I'm not very good at it." "Oh, so you got my letter?" "I did, and I'm ashamed to have upset you so much. All I wanted to say was that if you're serious, I mean really serious about this, I'd be honoured." At first she thought he was mocking her. Then she realised that he wasn't, and she was in such an evil humour that she was tempted to tell him she had changed her mind. Then common sense told her the man would be fool enough to believe her, and after that his pride wouldn't let him propose to her again. It was the price you had to pay for dealing with men who had such a high notion of their own dignity. "I suppose it depends on whether you love me or not," she replied. "It's a little matter you forgot to mention." He raised himself from the car window, and in the evening light she saw a look of positive pain on his lean, sad, gentle face. I do, but," he was beginning, when she cut him off and told him to get in the car. Whatever he was about to say, she didn't want to hear it. They settled down in a modern bungalow outside the town on the edge of the harbour. Elsie's mother, who flew over for the wedding, said dryly that she hoped Elsie would be able to make up to Tom for the loss of his mother's services. In fact, it wasn't long before the Barrys were saying she wasn't, and making remarks about her cooking and her lack of tidiness. But if Thomas noticed there was anything wrong, which is improbable, he didn't mention it. Whatever his faults as a sweetheart, he made a good husband. It may have been the affection of a sensitive man for someone he saw as frightened, fluttering and insecure. It could have been the longing of a frustrated one for someone that seemed to him remote, romantic and mysterious. But whatever it was, Tom, who had always been God Almighty to his mother and sisters, was extraordinarily patient and understanding with Elsie, and she needed it, because she was often homesick and scared. Jerry Coakley was a great comfort to her in these fits, for Jerry had a warmth of manner that Tom lacked. He was an insignificant-looking man with a ravaged, dyspeptic face and a tubercular complexion, a thin, bitter mouth with bad teeth and long, lank hair, but he was so sympathetic and insinuating that at times he even gave you the impression that he was changing his shape to suit your mood. Elsie had the feeling that the sense of failure had eaten deeper into him than into Tom. At once she started to arrange a match between him and Tom's elder sister Annie, in spite of Tom's warnings that Jerry would never marry till his mother died. When she realised that Tom was right, she said it was probably as well, because Annie wouldn't put his socks on him. Later she admitted that this was unfair and that it would probably be a great relief to poor Jerry to be allowed to put on his socks himself. Between Tom and him there was one of those passionate relationships that spring up in small towns where society narrows itself down to a handful of erratic and explosive relationships. There were always people who weren't talking to other people, and friends had all to be dragged into the disagreement, no matter how trifling it might be, and often it happened that the principals had already become fast friends again when their friends were still ignoring one another in the street. But Jerry and Tom refused to disagree. Jerry would drop in for a bottle of stout, and Tom and he would denounce the country, while Elsie wondered why they could never find anything more interesting to talk about than stupid priests and crooked politicians. Elsie's causes were of a different kind. The charwoman, Mrs. Dorgan, had 6 children and a husband who didn't earn enough to keep them. Elsie concealed from Tom how much she really paid Mrs. Dorgan, but she couldn't conceal that Mrs. Dorgan wore her clothes, or that she took the Dorgan family to the seaside in the summer. When Jerry suggested to Tom that the Dorgans might be doing too well out of Elsie, Tom replied, "Even if they were, Jerry, I wouldn't interfere. If it is people's nature to be generous, you must let them be generous." For Tom's causes, she had less patience. "Oh, why don't you people do something about it instead of talking?" she cried. "What could you do?" Elsie asked Jerry. "At least you could show them up," said Elsie. "Why, Elsie?" he asked with a mournful smile. "Were you thinking of starting a paper?" "Then if you can't do anything about it, shut up," she said. "You and Tom seem to get some queer masochistic pleasure out of these people." "Begorra, Elsie, you might have something there," Jerry said, nodding ruefully. "Oh, we adore them," Tom said mockingly. "You do," she said. "I've seen you. You sit here night after night denouncing them, and then when one of them gets sick, you're round to the house to see if there's anything you can do for him, and when he dies, you start a collection for his wife and family. You make me sick." Then she stamped out to the kitchen. Jerry hunched his shoulders and exploded in splutters and giggles. He reached out a big paw for a bottle of stout, with the air of someone snaring a rabbit. "I declare to God, Tom, she has us taped," he said. "She has you taped anyway," said Tom. "How's that?" "She thinks you need an American wife as well." "Well, now, she mightn't be too far out in that either," said Jerry with a crooked grin. "I often thought it would take something like that." "She thinks you have problems," said Tom with a snort. Elsie's favourite word gave him the creeps. She wouldn't be referring to the mother by any chance. For a whole year, Elsie had fits of depression because she thought she wasn't going to have a baby, and she saw several doctors, whose advice she repeated in mixed company, to the great embarrassment of everybody except Jerry. After that, for the best part of another year, she had fits of depression because she was going to have a baby, and she informed everybody about that as well, including the occasion of its conception and the probable date of its arrival, and again they were all embarrassed, only Jerry. Having reached the age of 18 before learning that there was any real difference between the sexes, Jerry found all her talk fascinating, and also he realised that Elsie saw nothing immodest in it. It was just that she had an experimental interest in her body and mind. When she gave him bourbon, he studied its taste, and when he gave her Irish, he studied its effect. It was as simple as that. Jerry too liked explanations, but he liked them for their own sake, and not with the intention of doing anything with them. At the same time, Elsie was scared by what she thought was a lack of curiosity on the part of the Cork doctors, and when her mother learned this, she began to press Elsie to have the baby in America, where she would feel secure. "You don't think I should go back, Tom?" she asked guiltily. "Daddy says he'll pay my fare." It came as a shock to Tom, though the idea had crossed his mind, that something of the kind might happen. "If that's the way you feel about it, I suppose you'd better, Elsie," he replied. "But you wouldn't come with me." "How can I come with you? You know I can't just walk out of the office for a couple of months." "But you could get a job at home." "And I told you a dozen times I don't want a job in America," he said angrily. Then, seeing the way it upset her, he changed his tone. "Look, if you stay here feeling the way you do, you'll work yourself into a real illness. Anyway, sometime you'll have to go back on a visit, and this is as good an occasion as any." "But how can I without you?" she asked. "You'd only neglect yourself." "I would not neglect myself." "You would stay at your mother's." "I would not stay at my mother's. This is my house, and I'm going to stop here." Tom worried less about the effect Elsie's leaving would have on him than about what his family would say, particularly Annie, who never lost the chance of a crack at Elsie. "You let that girl walk on you, Tom Barry," she said. "One of these days she'll walk too hard." Then, of course, Tom walked on her, in the way that only a devoted brother can. But that was no relief to the feeling that something had come between Elsie and him, and that he could do nothing about it. When he was driving Elsie to the liner, he knew that she felt the same, for she didn't break down until they came to a long grey bridge over an inlet of water, guarded by a lonely grey stone tower. She had once pointed it out to him as the first thing she had seen that represented Ireland to her, and now he had the feeling that this was how she saw him, a battered old tower by a river mouth that was no longer of any importance to anyone but the seagulls. She was away longer than she or anyone else had expected. First there was the wedding of an old school friend, then her mother's birthday, then the baby got ill. It was clear that she was enjoying herself immensely, but she wrote long and frequent letters, sent snapshots of herself and the baby, and most important of all, had named the baby for Jerry Coakley. Clearly Elsie hadn't forgotten him. The Dorgan kids appeared on the road in clothes that had obviously been made in America, and whenever Tom met them, he stopped to speak to them and give them the pennies he thought Elsie would have given them. Occasionally Tom went to his mother's for supper, but otherwise he looked after himself. Nothing could persuade him that he was not a natural housekeeper, or that whatever his sisters could do, he could not do just as well himself. Sometimes Jerry came and the two men took off their coats and tried to prepare a meal out of one of Elsie's cookbooks. "Steady, squad," Tom would murmur as he wiped his hands before taking another peep at the book. You never know when this might come in handy. But whether it was the result of Tom's supervision or Jerry's helplessness, the meal usually ended in a big burn-up or a tasteless mess from which some essential ingredient seemed to be missing, and they laughed over it as they consoled themselves with bread and cheese and stout. "Elsie is right," Jerry would say, shaking his head regretfully. "We have problems, boy, we have problems." Elsie returned at last, with trunks full of new clothes, a box of up-to-date kitchen stuff, and a new gaiety and energy. Every 10 minutes Tom would make an excuse to tiptoe upstairs and take another look at his son. Then the Barrys arrived, and Elsie gave immediate offence by quoting Gazelle and Spock. But Mrs. Barry didn't seem to mind as much as her daughters. By some extraordinary process of association, she had discovered a great similarity between Elsie and herself in the fact that she had married from the south side of the city into the north and had never got used to it. This delighted Elsie, who went about proclaiming that her mother-in-law and herself were both displaced persons. The next year was a very happy one, and less trying on Elsie, because she had another woman to talk to, even as most of the time she didn't understand what her mother-in-law was telling her, and had the suspicion that her mother-in-law didn't understand her either. But then she got pregnant for the second time and became restless and dissatisfied once more, though now it wasn't only with hospitals and doctors, but with schools and school teachers as well. Tom and Jerry had impressed on her that the children were being turned into idiots, learning through the medium of a language they didn't understand. Indeed, according to Tom, it was a language that nobody understood. What chance would the children have? "I suppose the same chance as the rest of us, Elsie," said Jerry in a sly, mournful way. But you and Tom don't want chances, Jerry, she replied earnestly. Neither of you has any ambition. You should look on the bright side of things. Maybe with God's help they won't have any ambition either. But this time it had gone beyond a joke. For days on end, Tom was in a rage with her, and when he was angry he seemed to withdraw into himself like a snail into a shell. Unable to get to him, Elsie grew hysterical. "It's all your damned obstinacy," she sobbed. "You don't do anything in this rotten hole, but you're too conceited to get out of it. Your family treats you as if you were God, and then you behave to me as if you were God, God, God," she screamed, and each time she punched him viciously with her fist, till suddenly the humour of their situation struck him and he went off into laughter. After that he could only make his peace with her and make excuses for her leaving him again, but he knew that the excuses wouldn't impress his sisters. One evening when he went to see them, Annie caught him, as she usually did, when he was going out the front door, and he stood looking sideways down the avenue. "I don't know," Tom said, pulling his long nose with an air of affected indifference. "I can't very well stop her, can I?" "Damn soon she'd be stopped if she hadn't the money," said Annie. "And you're going to let her take young Jerry?" How could I look after Jerry? Talk sense, can't you? And I suppose we couldn't look after him either. We're not sufficiently well read." The child should be with his own mother, Annie," Tom said impatiently. "And where should his mother be?" Tom Barry," she added bitterly. "I told you what that one was, and she's not done with you yet. Are you sure she's going to bring him back?" Then Tom exploded on her in his cold, savage way. "If you want to know, I'm not sure," he said, and strode down the avenue with his head slightly bowed. Something about the cut of him as he passed under a street lamp almost broke Annie's heart. "The curse of God on that bitch," she said when she returned to her mother in the kitchen. "Is it Elsie?" her mother cried angrily. "How dare you talk of her like that?" "He's letting her go to America again," said Annie. "He's a good boy and he's right to consider her feelings," said her mother anxiously. "I often thought myself I'd go back to the south side and not be ending my days in this misfortunate hole." The months after Elsie's second departure were bitter ones for Tom. A house from which a woman is gone is bad enough, but one from which a child is gone is a dead house. Tom would awake in the middle of the night thinking he heard Jerry crying, and be half out of bed when he realised that Jerry was thousands of miles away. He did not continue his experiments with cooking and housekeeping. He ate at his mother's, spent most of his time at the Coakley's, and drank far too much. Like all inward-looking men, he had a heavy hand on the bottle. Meanwhile, Elsie wavered and procrastinated worse than before, setting dates, cancelling her passage, sometimes changing her mind within 24 hours. In his despondency, Tom resigned himself to the idea that she wouldn't return at all, or at least persuaded himself that he had. "Oh, she'll come back all right," Jerry said with a worried air. "The question is, will she stay back?" "You don't mind me talking about it?" he asked. "Indeed no, why would I? You know, Tom, I'd say you had family enough to last you another few years." Tom didn't look up for a few moments, and when he did, he smiled faintly. "You think it's that?" "I'm not saying she knows it," Jerry added hastily. "There's nothing calculating about her, and she's crazy about you." "I thought it was something that went with having the baby," Tom said thoughtfully. "Some sort of homing instinct." "I wouldn't say so," said Jerry. "Not altogether. I think she feels that eventually she'll get you through the kids." "She won't," Tom said bitterly. "I know, sure I know, but Elsie can't get used to they're irremediable." The last word was so unlike Jerry that Tom felt he must have looked it up in a dictionary, and the absurdity of this made him feel very close to his old crony. "Tell me, Tom," Jerry added gently, "wouldn't you do it? I know it wouldn't be easy, but wouldn't you try it, even for a while, for Elsie's sake? 'Twould mean a hell of a lot to her." "I'm too old, Jerry," Tom said so deliberately that Jerry knew it had been in his mind as well. "Oh, I know," Jerry repeated. "Even 10 years ago I might have done it myself. It's like jail. The time comes when you're happier in than out. And that's not the worst of it," he added bitterly. "The worst is when you pretend you like it." It was a strange evening that neither of them ever forgot, sitting in that little house to which Elsie's absence seemed a rebuke, and listening to the wind from the harbour that touched the foot of the garden. They knew they belonged to a country whose youth was always escaping from it, out beyond that harbour, and that was middle-aged in all its attitude and institutions. Of those that remained, a little handful lived with defeat and learned fortitude and humour and sweetness, and these were the things that Elsie, with her generous idealism, loved in them. But she couldn't pay the price. She wanted them where she belonged herself, among the victors. A few weeks later, Elsie was back. The house was full of life again, and that evening seemed only a bad dream. It was almost impossible to keep Jerry Og, as they called the elder child, away from Tom. He was still only a baby, and a spoiled one at that, but when Tom took him to the village, Jerry Og thrust out his chest and took strides that were too big for him, like any small boy with a father he admired. Each day he lay in wait for the postman and then took the post away to sort it for himself. He sorted it by the pictures on the stamps, and Elsie noted gleefully that he reserved all the pretty pictures for his father. Nobody had remembered Jerry's good advice, even Jerry himself, and 18 months later Elsie was pregnant again. Again their lives took the same pattern of unrest, but this time Elsie was even more distressed than Tom. "I'm a curse to you," she said. "There's something wrong with me. I can't be natural." "Oh, you're natural enough," Tom replied bitterly. "You married the wrong man, that's all." I didn't, she protested despairingly. "You can say anything else but that. If I believed that, I'd have nothing left, because I never cared for anyone but you. And in spite of what you think, I'm coming back," she went on in tears. "I'm coming back if it kills me. God, I hate this country. I hate every goddamn thing about it. I hate what it's done to you and Jerry. But I'm not going to let you go." "You have no choice," Tom said patiently. "Jerry Og will have to go to school, and you can't be bringing him hither and over, even if you could afford it." "Then if that's what you feel, why don't you keep him?" she cried. "You know perfectly well you could stop me taking him with me if you wanted to. You wouldn't even have to bring me into court. I'll give him to you. Isn't that proof enough that I'm coming back?" "No, Elsie, it is not," Tom replied, measuring every word. "And I'm not going to bring you into court either. I'm not going to take hostages to make sure my wife comes back to me." And though Elsie continued to delude herself with the belief that she would return, she knew Tom was right. It would all appear different when she got home. The first return to Ireland had been hard, the second had seemed impossible. Yet even in the black hours, when she really considered the situation, she felt she could never resign herself to something that had been determined before she was born, and she deceived herself with the hope that Tom would change his mind and follow her. He must follow her. Even if he was prepared to abandon her, he would never abandon Jerry Og. And this, as Big Jerry could have told her, was where she made her biggest mistake, because if Tom had done it at all, it would have been for her. But Big Jerry had decided that the whole thing had gone beyond his power to help. He recognised the irremediable all right, sometimes perhaps even before it became irremediable. But that, as he would have said himself, is where the ferry boat had left him. Thanks to Elsie, the eldest of the Dorgans now has a job in Boston, and in the course of years the rest of them will probably go there as well. Tom continues to live in his little bungalow beside the harbour. Annie is keeping house for him, which suits her fine, because Big Jerry's old mother continued to put his socks on for him a few years too long, and now Annie has only her brother to worship. To all appearances they are happy enough, as happiness goes in Cork. Jerry still calls, and the two men discuss the terrible state of the country. But in Tom's bedroom there are pictures of Elsie and the children, the third of whom he knows only through photographs, and apart from that, nothing has changed since Elsie left 5 years ago. It is a strange room, for one glance is enough to show that the man who sleeps there is still in love, and that everything that matters to him in the world is reflected there. And one day, if he comes by the dollars, he will probably go out and visit them all. But it is here he will return, and here no doubt he will die.